Okay, so as Zoe mentioned, my name is Brooke. I am a researcher at the University of Pittsburgh, and today I will be talking about what bioacoustics is, what the heck a bioacoustician is, and how I became one. So first, I want to talk a little bit about how I got into biology. So I didn't always know that I wanted to be a biologist, nevertheless a bioacoustician, but I always enjoyed nature. Living in a more urban area in New York, I did feel that nature was something that was separate from myself. I always had a view of nature as something you had to get in your car and drive to. It was like a day trip or a vacation that you had to seek out. And I didn't really feel like I existed within nature or that it was really around me. But that changed my junior year of high school. My dad found a small wildlife sanctuary near our house and thought I might enjoy it. So I joined him on his next trip to it, and I really enjoyed this like tiny sliver of nature. And I want to emphasize how small this area was. Standing in the middle of it, you could see a big Amazon warehouse at the other side. And a 1 minute walk from the center of it would have you at a gas station. But I was very impressed by all of the animals that I saw thriving in this really small space, despite the very harsh urban environment around them. And it wasn't the mere existence of this place that got me into biology, but actually a specific interaction with a resident of the sanctuary. So one day while I was walking on the trails, I heard this. Now, let me know, Zoe, if the audio worked that time. Okay, hopefully everyone could hear that. Um, but that's what I heard. And I was very confused and disturbed by like the screeching noises that I just heard in the woods, and was very curious as to what I was hearing. So I did some investigation with my binoculars and I found that it was a juvenile barred owl. And this was its begging call. So it was giving this call to tell its parents that it was hungry and it wanted food right now. And if it didn't get food right now, it would keep screeching. So it's pretty effective. And I was really shocked to see such a majestic, in my opinion, animal in this tiny urban wildlife sanctuary. I thought that an owl was something that would exist in a really pristine, like state park or national park, not something so close to my own backyard. And seeing such a beautiful animal so close to where I lived made me realize that it was actually like the stewardship of these small areas, something akin to like a backyard or a front lawn that could be so important for these animals. So, because of this interaction, I became interested in how we could keep the landscape safe for birds and even maybe improve it so that we could attract some more. I would love to have some more owls at all times. So I started volunteering with my local Audubon Society, which is a bird conservation organization. And I started doing this in my senior year of high school. I also started working with a wildlife rehabilitator, nursing like sick birds back to health. And I enjoyed all of this. So, like on the top right, you can see me about to release a baby American robin that we raised for the summer because it lost its parents. And on the bottom, I'm in the midst of some bird walks, learning how to identify birds. I had an awesome time doing this, but I had yet to meet someone who actually had made a career out of bird conservation. And that changed when I went to Acadia National Park and I met a park ranger. She led me on a tour of the park where we pointed out birds and different things the park was doing to keep a bird-friendly habitat. And I was inspired to actually try and make birds my job. Seeing someone else do it, I decided to try it myself, even though it seemed like kind of a long shot. Like, how do you make birds your job? So I had to figure out how I could spend my life researching birds. And I went off to college with the goal of figuring out how I could do that. So here I decided to make a collage of all of the birds I have held throughout the last couple of years of figuring out how I could become a professional bird scientist. And there are a lot of different ways to study birds. So this is reflected in all of the different ways you can study biology. You could study how birds are related to each other. You could study how birds are related to dinosaurs. You could study how birds transmit diseases to each other and humans. You can study how birds interact with the environment around them and also different animals. And it's kind of overwhelming to figure out what you want to research. So, throughout college, I tried a bunch of different things. I studied birds in pretty much every way you could think to study them. I did more bird rehabilitation. So, on the top left, a little to the right, you can see two baby great horned owls that I helped to get ready for real life after they fell out of their nest. I researched hormone levels of birds. I researched what their feather color meant for their health, their nest success, their survival rates between years. I even went to Montana for a summer and I studied how the breeding birds of the Great Plains interacted with prairie dogs. I researched if you could detect an owl in a forest based on just the presence of its DNA in a local water source. I tried to figure out if you could stop them from hitting windows by applying window stickers. And I even learned how to do taxidermy and taught other people how to do bird taxidermy. So pretty much, if there was an angle to look at birds from, I had looked at it about 1,000 times, and I did enjoy all of it. But there was one specific type of research that really caught my interest, and that was bioacoustics. So, to get into what bioacoustics is, bioacoustics is the study of how animals use sound to communicate, and it's also the study of how these sounds relate to their environmental conditions. So, how did I actually get into this? Throughout undergrad, I spent 2 summers and a lot of time researching the song of the northern cardinal, which is a bird you might be familiar with in Maine. 30 or so years ago, it really wasn't in the state. But because of warming climates and the increased use of bird feeders, they love bird feeders, they've really expanded throughout the state of Maine. And I specifically wanted to figure out if the traits of Northern Cardinal song, like for example, how long the song was, reflected how healthy a male cardinal was. So maybe a healthier cardinal is singing a longer song. And this is important because Northern cardinals use their song to display traits about themselves to potential females they might want to mate with. So if a male song is pretty much saying, I am really healthy and my kids would be really healthy, it's really important information to communicate. But we don't know if that's what their song is saying. We just think it might be. And through studying that in college, I got very interested in other ways we could use bioacoustics, maybe for things like conservation for endangered species. And so before we get into using bioacoustics for conservation, I have to explain how we actually do bioacoustics research. So the important thing to understand about bioacoustics as a field is that it is really all based around a spectrogram. So right here on screen, I have a spectrogram, and that is just a graphical representation of sound. So on the y-axis here, you have frequency, and then on the x-axis, you have time. And then the redder you see a point on this graph, the louder the sound is. So to give you a better idea of what's actually going on in a spectrogram, um, I will use this little site. Hopefully this is working, Zoe. Okay, awesome. So what this site is doing right now is creating a spectrogram of my voice, of me speaking. So you can see that every time I say a word, a bunch of lines appear on this, and those are the different frequencies that my voice is making. The redder parts of this are the louder frequencies. So a human voice kind of just looks like a bunch of lines, but a bird song looks a little simpler and a little more concentrated. And I'll show you a bunch of examples of what that actually looks like. But that is an idea of what a spectrogram is. And the concept of an a sound becoming an image is really important because AI can recognize images. So, sound being displayed as an image could allow you to give AI or artificial intelligence something like thousands of hours of audio recording, and then you could just ask it to tell you what birds it can find in that image, which is originally the audio. So this could be really revolutionary for ornithology. And I got very interested in it because it's new technology. We are still developing this. In the last 10 years, it has really come to the forefront of ornithology, which ornithology is the study of birds. And we haven't really mastered using this yet. So I liked how kind of cutting edge this research was. And to understand how we really do ornithology now, essentially, to collect good ornithology data, imagine waking up on a warm summer day at 4 a.m. and traveling to a study site. You set up at your point for 10 minutes, and in those 10 minutes, you record every bird that you hear from that spot. After the 10 minutes are up, you pack up your things, hop in your car, and you go to your next point. And this will be your routine until around 11 a.m., which is when most birds stop singing for the day. This type of data collection is really like the backbone of modern ornithology. Having these 10-minute point counts across the country, across decades, is how we have figured out what birds are increasing or decreasing and how we have planned conservation. But this data is very far from perfect, and that is because humans are not perfect. We're collecting the data. So when a human goes out and tries to identify all the birds they hear, they might be tired, they might be bored, they might forget certain birds, and that can cause a really big issue if you're using this information to figure out if there's an endangered species in the area, for example. It's also really difficult to find people who are talented at identifying birds by sound. So this is kind of where bioacoustics can come in to solve this issue. And it comes in through the use of autonomous recording units, or ARUs. ARUs are essentially these tiny computers that you can program to, for example, record for 2 hours in the morning. You can leave them outside, and they will record for 2 hours in the morning until their batteries die. That can be months. And they'll record all of this information to an SD card that's in the unit. So if you have, for example, a study design with 150 points, if you wanted to figure out what birds are at those points using humans, you would probably send people out to those points, maybe 2 visits per point. You would get a 10-minute point count at each visit. So that's 20 minutes of data for each point. Compared to an ARU, where with just 2 visits, the first visit being the one where you deploy the recording unit, and then the next visit being the one where you pick up the recording unit, in between the deployment and the pickup, you might have 2 months where the ARU records for 2 hours each morning. So that is 120 hours of information per point, compared to just 20 minutes for humans. If you're looking for an endangered species that you maybe will only hear from your point 2 or 3 times a day, the human is probably going to miss it because they're not there long enough. But the ARU is there for 120 hours. You're probably going to pick up those rare species. So this, as you can kind of see now, could revolutionize how we do these biodiversity surveys. But it's not super easy to get through 120 hours of data. You could listen to it manually and do what we call an ARU point count. But here's my coworker doing an ARU point count, and you can tell he's kind of stressed out. It's still hard, and it has the same issues as the real in-person point count that I described earlier, where humans can be tired, they can make mistakes, and we want to try and avoid those mistakes. So this is where our AI comes back into play. So that's just doing this manually is not the best way to use our data. The best way to use this is to create a convolutional neural network. So essentially, this is a type of AI. You might be more familiar with a different type of AI called ChatGPT. ChatGPT is called a large language model. Essentially, ChatGPT is trained on text information. You can think of the convolutional neural network that we create to identify audio as ChatGPT, but for images. So when we take our audio, we transform it into the spectrogram or like the picture of what the audio looks like. Then we can tell our AI, hey, this is what, for example, the song of a northern cardinal looks like. Now I'm going to give you 120 hours of audio, and I want you to find all of the northern cardinals in that. So how do we actually use this for conservation? We can begin by using bioacoustics to study a declining population. For example, eastern forest birds. So 6 in 10 wood thrushes, for example, have been lost since 1970, 17% population decline in eastern forest birds. They're not doing so great, and we think that this is because of habitat loss. But what we don't understand right now is what habitats they actually prefer. If we know what they like, we can make more of it, but we kind of don't understand what they do like. So we decided we would use ARUs to figure out what habitats these birds do like, and we would test this against humans. So we went to 600 points. At each point, we had a point count by a human, and we also set up our ARU. And this allowed us to create a what we call a detection history. So if a human visits a point twice, then you have a 2-day detection history because they visited the point on 2 different days. But with our ARUs, we created a 10-day detection history because we had the recorders record for 10 days. Using this data, we wanted to answer the question of, can humans or ARUs detect more birds? So who won? The ARU won. So for one of our target species, the wood thrush, we created our own AI model to recognize the wood thrush songs in our audio. Using this model, we found that the ARU audio found wood thrush at 10% more sites than humans. This is pretty similar to the humans, and that's because wood thrush are very common. They vocalize a lot, they're all over the landscape, and so humans can also detect them pretty well. The really interesting point was the other bird we were looking for, which is the cerulean warbler. This bird is very rare, it is hard to find, and it vocalizes a lot less. So the humans missed it at most sites. They just weren't there long enough to hear it. But the ARU was there for 10 days, and it found the cerulean warblers at 50% more sites than humans did. So this is double the birds. That is a huge deal when you're looking at a almost endangered species like the cerulean warbler. And because we found it, we can understand what habitats it likes, and we can make more of that habitat. We also really wanted to figure out if AI can tell birds apart. So just like humans, birds have different voices. This, for example, is a song sparrow. These are 2 different song sparrow songs. First, I'll play Jim's song. And then a different bird's song. I named him Bob. So you might listen to that and not really be able to pick out what's different. It just kind of sounds like a bunch of chaos. But lucky for us, the images of these songs look different. And as I mentioned, if it looks different, if it's a different image, AI can tell it apart. And that's what we found, was that our AI models were really good at saying, this is a different song than this song. And we can tell as a biologist that if there's different songs, there's different birds. So using this information, we can map where birds like to be on really small patches of landscape. We can figure out where they interact with each other, and we can even figure out if they return to the same places year after year because they sing the same song every year. So if we can understand that they are returning to the same places, we can understand if they're surviving. And if they aren't returning every year, something might be going wrong in the population and they're declining. And we can start to do more urgent conservation work because we know that something is going wrong in the population that we would not have known had we not had AI telling us that there was different birds. So this is a small snapshot of all of the different ways that you can use AI to understand what's happening in a population. And all of this is also to say that birds can be your job. And I was able to successfully make birds my job. I'm a researcher at the University of Pittsburgh. On the top right is me and all my coworkers who spend all day trying to figure out how we can improve the world for birds and how we can use AI and bioacoustics to understand where the birds are and how they're doing. And it is awesome. And I also wanted to mention how you can use AI to help birds. So I talked a little bit about how we developed machine learning classifiers for certain birds to understand where they are and detect them in our audio. But there is an app you can get on your phone called Merlin, which is a classifier that is already pre-made, all done, and all you have to do is walk outside, hit record, and it will tell you what birds it's hearing around you. And Zoe and I spent some time in 2023 testing out Merlin's performance against humans. And we found that Merlin did a pretty good job identifying birds, but that it wasn't perfect. And that's why we always, when we're using AI, we validate the results. So AI is a new technology, it makes a lot of mistakes. And when we use it to identify birds, we double check its answers essentially and make sure that what it's telling us is actually true. But Merlin was pretty good. It made some mistakes, but it was pretty good. And it's a great tool to help you learn the birds around you. So if you use Merlin to learn what birds are in your area, and you get more familiar with them, you can then submit the birds that you do see to something called eBird. And eBird is essentially a giant database of birders around the world submitting the birds they see. And we use this for conservation to understand birds' ranges changing in response to climate events. It's really powerful, and you can submit your data to it and be a part of bird conservation science. So I highly encourage you to download Merlin on your phone or tablet or whatever you have, and just start messing around with it and see what birds are around you. So I know I talked a lot about bioacoustics, but of course there are also a lot of other bird things that I have done in my career, so I'm happy to answer questions about any of it.
Thank you so much, Brooke. What a fun surprise to have that picture at the end. I don't think I saw that before. Um, if anyone has any questions, feel free to throw them into the chat. I'm sure we're happy to get those answered. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for some questions to pop up, I have a question.
Mhm.
What's something that you are super excited about for the future of your field?
I think one thing I'm very excited for the future is the ability to not just detect the song of a bird and say like, yes, it sang here, but to even detect the begging calls of juveniles, and say, we found like a baby bird here. And if you find a baby bird somewhere, that means that the birds are using that habitat to have their babies. It's where they're choosing to raise their family. And that's the most important habitat to conserve. So figuring out ways to figure out how birds are using the landscape through their different behavioral calls, like a begging call, like the owl I showed, really excites me because it could really help us find important places for birds.
Yeah, that'd be very cool. We have a question coming from Sacopee Valley, which is, has this ever been used for mammals? And I'll expand on that. Just, has it ever been used for mammals or any other types of animals?
Yes, so I talked a lot about birds today because that's what I focus on, but this, like these bioacoustic techniques have been used for everything. Kind of the birth of bioacoustics was in a lot of like marine mammals. And figuring out where like whales are and dolphins are. People use bioacoustics for fish because fish actually make vocalizations. And to get into specifically mammals, a really great example is like wolves and coyotes because you can identify different wolves and coyotes by their howls. So just like we have different voices, a wolf has a different voice, and you can figure out, oh, I know that wolf because you can recognize its howl. So people use that to figure out how many wolves are maybe in a place like, for example, Yellowstone. And if you know how many wolves there are, you know if something's going wrong or something's going right. So people use bioacoustics for mammals all the time.
Nice. Yeah, I feel like, do you think it could also be used for things like insects that like make different noises?
Yeah, the one thing I really love about bioacoustics is that if it makes a noise, you can identify it. And so people use this for insects, like I think a good example is crickets because they have kind of a unique noise that they make. People also use this for frogs. So my lab does a lot of research figuring out how frogs are doing in response to disease outbreaks based on the noises they're making. So it's amazing what you can identify using bioacoustics.
Yeah. I'm seeing a kind of related question, which is, do you think that AI will replace wildlife biologists?
This is an amazing question, and I feel like I didn't get to touch on it enough in my presentation. I should have. But no, I do not think that AI will replace wildlife biologists, but I do think that wildlife biologists will have to work with AI as a part of their career. So, for example, I've done hundreds of point counts in my career, but I know now that an ARU and a machine learning classifier can probably get a better idea of what birds are somewhere than like me going there for a shorter period of time. But someone has to train the machine learning classifier, and someone needs to be able to interpret the biology behind the machine learning classifier output. So it's definitely complicated. I think some parts of biology, AI will maybe replace some things that we used to do, but we still have to steward this new technology, and I do not see any humans getting replaced anytime soon.
It's good news. Okay, another question is, what is one of the best experiences you've had in the fields?
I think one of my favorite experiences in the field was, this is hard. There's a lot, but I think seeing in Montana endangered species and seeing how our conservation efforts can directly impact like numbers for very small populations. Just doing things like figuring out which habitat to restore to maybe better condition, the birds return. And I think a really good example, which is not a bird, is a swift fox. Very rare, I think endangered in Montana, but it returned to the prairie in places where we started to protect its habitat. And I got to see the mammal biologist who had been studying that fox for like a decade see it for the first time. And it was a very beautiful moment. Like everyone was crying. It was very powerful. So seeing what humans can actually do to impact wildlife was very amazing.
That is so cool. And I have another kind of hard question for you, which is how many different species have you studied?
Oh, I actually don't even know if I can answer this question. It's so many. It's so many. Um, it's a lot. I've studied a lot of birds, but I've also worked with like frogs and mammals. But I think if I had to put a number to the amount of animals that I've really put some work into studying, it's probably 20 that I've really gotten invested in. But some birds stand out. The northern cardinals have very big personalities, so they always stick out in my mind when I think of birds I've done research on.
Another question is, what is the most important species to you?
That's hard. So there's a concept in ecology of indicator species, and this is essentially a species where if something is going wrong in the environment, they'll kind of be the first one to show effects. So a good example is if a stream is polluted, the first species you might see start to decline are frogs because their skin is porous. And I think for me, this species ends up being raptors. So because raptors, like a bald eagle, are at the top of the food chain, they feel all of the effects from the bottom up. From the smallest effect, it just multiplies to a bird like a bald eagle. So to me, some of those like really big birds that are at the top of the food chain, to me, are the most important because they indicate the health of an ecosystem. So if you see like, for example, an osprey around, that means that there's a healthy water source for it to be fishing in. So I tend to really focus, I think, on some of those indicator species.
Nice. Very cool. Another question is, can AI watch a bird's flight pattern?
So that's a really good question. And I'm not sure if so I'm sure that AI could watch a flight pattern if you were maybe like in a lab and you had a bird in the lab in a controlled environment. But one really interesting thing that can watch bird flight patterns is weather radar. So when birds are migrating, they migrate in groups of billions of birds. And it's so many birds that it shows up on weather radar. And it kind of looks like a storm cloud, but you can tell it's not a storm cloud because it moves in a very concentrated direction. Um, and people use radar to figure out how many birds are moving in flight during migration. So AI is losing to, I would say, weather radar in that realm of figuring out different flight patterns.
Wow, I did not know that. We had
It's
a
very cool.
meteorologist talk for our last scientist to go. We were talking about radar for a while. I'll have to let her know. That's so cool.
Mhm.
Okay, another question. Do you know if this technology is used in Maine?
Yes, this technology is used in Maine. So I worked for around a year at Acadia National Park, setting up a bioacoustics kind of surveying technique at two different wetlands in the park. And we wanted to figure out essentially which wetland the birds preferred. So I spent a year putting up recording units and collecting data, and I started to analyze the data to see which areas the birds preferred. And we plan to use that over the next, honestly, decade or so as one of those wetlands gets restored to maybe a better condition for birds. And we want to see how the bird community changes. So that's a small example of how this is being used specifically in Acadia, but there are different researchers all around the state of Maine using bioacoustics to understand birds, but even frogs and mammals and bugs.
Nice. So yeah, it's everywhere. This new bioacoustics study. Very cool. Okay. Another fun question is, why are some birds red or blue if they need to blend in with their environment?
This is the question of the century for a lot of biologists. And there are a lot of different theories, but one that is really agreed upon is that there's a trade-off between blending in to survive and standing out so you can find a mate. So, for example, this really red northern cardinal that I have here, he's really red because it helps him stand out to females. Females are choosing which male they want to mate with. And so if he stands out and he looks really snazzy, she might choose him. But it's a trade-off because he also stands out to a hawk that's flying by. So you evolutionarily find that balance of standing out just enough to find a mate, but blending in enough, or maybe having the skills to hide, even if you don't blend in, to at least have the skills to escape a predator so that it's worth it to be bright red. It's really interesting. And when you go to somewhere like South America, where it's a lot warmer, but there's also a slightly lesser threat of predation for a lot of adult birds. They can look really bizarre. They can be like neon orange and they don't blend in at all. But because there's less of a risk of predation, they can just kind of look however they want. So it's a big trade-off. Yeah, it's like choosing if you want to stand out or if you want to live. It's very challenging, but if you're a northern cardinal, life is being read, so you got to commit.
Okay, and then we have one final question, which is I have an answer to this one, but what is the funniest experience you've had with a bird?
I've had so many funny, weird experiences with birds. This is challenging, but I think the funniest one that I ever had was when I was researching nestlings. I would take them out of the nest and they'd be like little babies. And I once had a whole camera crew follow me to understand like what it was that I was doing and how we were studying birds. And I was really nervous and I was trying to be professional. So I took one of the nestlings, and I was explaining its biology and it pooped on my hand and it was disgusting. And I tried to like be serious, but it was like so hard to be serious. So I think that's one of the funnier experiences I've had with birds. They always humble me, but I'm very curious as to what yours is, Zoe.
Oh my gosh. Well, this comes from when we were both working in Acadia National Park, and there was a spruce grouse, which is
Oh
a type
yeah.
of bird that lives on primarily on the ground. So they run around through the forest. They're very cool, but they're very territorial. So if you get too close to them, they will run at you and
Yes.
they will jump on your leg and they will peck. And I got too close. I didn't see it coming. And it stepped on me, and it was very scary, but he was defending his territory. He deserved to do that. I was too close.
Yes, and I had a similar experience with this same exact bird and it jumped on my head. So that's actually also a really good example of a funny, amazing bird that you can find like all over Maine. They are amazing.
They're very cool.
Yep.
Well, I think that's all of our questions. So thank you so much, Brooke. This was so much fun. I'm gonna stop recording.